All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our sixth and final week together for PPA 535. Hope everyone is doing well. Again, as I told you last week, for this week, both of our sessions, both tonight as well as on Saturday morning, we have very full sessions ahead of us because we have quite a few articles that we have left to finish up. For tonight, we have 6 articles on the agenda, and then for Saturday morning, we also have 6 articles. So we'll probably fill up most of our time tonight as well as on Saturday. Since we do have so many articles to cover, I am going to really curtail my comments, and so I won't be making as many comments on the articles as I have in past weeks. It doesn't mean you're not doing a good job with your discussion. It just means we have limited time, and I'm much more interested in what you have to say and you leading your discussion as compared to my observations on the articles. But real quick, before we get started, reminder, you have your final beach board essay that is due on Saturday, since Saturday is our last day of class. For that one, it looks at Homeland Security, and you'll be selecting one example of threat to Homeland Security or a natural disaster or something along those lines, and discussing that threat to Homeland Security in terms of the roles played by the different levels of government. I do ask for that one that you try and stay away from Hurricane Katrina, because there's literally, it created an entire cottage industry of academic articles on federalism and Hurricane Katrina. And so that one's kind of been there and done that. And so perhaps, focus on another natural disaster or other type of threat to Homeland Security. And that's your final beach board posting due then on Saturday. For tonight, our primary topic will be current and new challenges and issues for American intergovernmental relations. And as I said, we have 6 articles on the agenda for tonight. We'll start out tonight with the politics of unfunded mandates, the Posner article, which Bernie has. Then we'll do American Public Administration, which is Jacqueline's, Homeland Security, which is Jello's. Jelani will do the intergovernmental relations article for us. Steve has the fiscal federalism and economic crises article. And then because of some scheduling issues, we're going to have Perla do the article last, the federalism by waiver article. So that will be the final one that we will cover tonight. So a total of 6 articles for discussion. Okay, any questions or anything before we jump into it and get going tonight? Okay. All right, then without any further ado, we'll start out with Paul Posner's Politics of Unfunded Mandates, and that one belongs to Bernie. So Bernie, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
All righty. Good evening, Professor and fellow cohort. Tonight, I will be presenting Article 22, which is the Politics of Unfunded Mandates by Paul L. Posner. Starting with the implications of the new policymaking process, the author states that the classic notions of federalism and policymaking suggested that Congress would afford state and local governments great deference in the formulation of national policy. One of the factors for this was that national office holders depended on state and local parties to remain in office. This institutional deference was reflected in a presumption against coercive federal mandates and preemptions on state and local governments, which was considered to be one of the rules of the policymaking process in the system before the 1960s. This made it hard to make bold policy changes since the system was stacked against major policy initiatives. There was also perseverance of a policy incrementalism philosophy, and there were numerous veto points within Congress. Also, classic political literature suggested that proposed mandate legislation would lead to heated conflict and debates in Congress. Consensus on issues was only expected in areas where the stakes were small or where policy monopolies prevented the emergence of groups with conflicting perspectives. State and local governments were expected to mobilize more effectively than advocates representing the more diffuse interests of regulatory beneficiaries. The conflict was expected to become partisan, with Republican allies of states and local governments mobilizing to oppose federal power over the states and local governments. The congressional adoption of mandates and preemptions from the 1970s to the 1990s is at odds with the rules of the game that were established prior to the 1960s. Mandates became a major instrument of national policy, with members of both parties using them to support policy goals. Mandates continued to be adopted through the 1980s and 1990s, even though this was considered to be a conservative era of governance. Mandate restraint and rollback were apparent in 1996, most likely due to the passage of the Unfunded Mandate Reform Act of 1995. However, Congress still enacted significant mandates and preemptions during this period. This rapid passage of mandates signaled the emergence of a new style of federal policymaking. Non-incremental policy reforms were adopted, and ideas from influential experts and policy entrepreneurs made their way to an activist Congress that wanted to take credit for legislation appealing to broadly shared values championed by the media. Congress members became policy entrepreneurs in search of new policy ideas to gain media attention and political support. Congress members from both sides were compelled to sponsor national programs and policies, including embracing domestic programs, such as those improving education or reducing crime, which are functions that are traditionally performed by state and local governments. This implicated both state and local governments in national policymaking. Since the nation dislikes the federal government funding and providing domestic services that are typically provided at the state and local levels, the federal government used grants and mandates, also known as carrots and sticks, to compel state and local governments to participate in the process. The federal government first used grants to diffuse opposition or resistance to mandates. However, over time, the grants strengthened beneficiary coalitions and generated support from state and local bureaucracies and leaders. As these programs developed at the state and local level, the legitimacy of the federal role grew stronger, and mandates came to be seen as a logical and appropriate tool to promote national uniformity. The growing political strength of beneficiary coalitions allowed them to influence and convince policymakers to use coercive policy tools such as mandates. These coalitions were so strong that they even succeeded in getting the necessary federal funding for state and local compliance when peacetime federal budget deficits were at their highest in the 1980s and 1990s. This pattern supports John Kincaid's conclusion that the era of cooperative federalism, characterized by a reliance on grants, led to a more coercive federal role, epitomized by the use of mandates. During this time, some of the most fiscally burdensome mandates were being passed consensually, without the conflict or deliberation typically expected in regulatory policymaking. State and local groups were not mobilized to oppose proposed legislation, and Congress enacted expensive mandates in what seemed to be a race to claim credit for resolving issues. Mandate advocates defined proposed mandates as politically compelling causes that could not be publicly opposed by conservatives or state and local interest groups. Since the conflicts were defined by benefit instead of cost, the proposed legislation moved at a very fast pace. This pattern of policymaking is illustrated by Baumgartner and Jones's punctuated equilibrium model, which states that stable policy areas can suddenly be replaced by a new political and policy regime, with major policy changes being accomplished riding a wave of enthusiasm without any serious opposition. Policy areas are hard to challenge, and political actors are said to oppose only at their own peril. In this policy model, the political system lurches from one equilibrium to another, with change happening rapidly and by acclamation. The model by Baumgartner and Jones is similar to Anthony Downs' issue attention cycle, which states that non-incremental policy change can occur through a process of alarm discovery and euphoric enthusiasm. Public pressure to solve a problem often emerges after objective indicators of the problem have already peaked. Downsian mobilization occurs for valence issues, in which only one side of the debate is considered to be legitimate. It is difficult for affected interests to mobilize against these issues once they reach agenda status, but they are also difficult to solve, which results in a loss of political and public interest over time. The author indicates that elected officials are more vulnerable to bandwagon politics than ever before. With the erosion of allegiances to political parties and state and local government leaders, members of Congress are said to be more atomistic, with less protection if they end up being on the wrong side of a publicly compelling issue. Since they are operating in a transparent environment with the media providing their constituents with images of their performance, public officials want to avoid the perception of being on the wrong side of issues and pursue politically compelling issues, irrespective of party ideology. One of the major factors leading to the rapid adoption of mandates was the neutralization or weakening of actors and constraints that were expected to prevent the expansion of federal power in the system. The Supreme Court provided the rationale for an expanded federal role in domestic policy from the 1930s to the 1990s, ruling that states and local governments have to look to the political process instead of the 10th Amendment to protect their jurisdictional prerogatives. These rulings essentially enabled Congress to achieve its policy goals through mandates and preemptions. Although Republicans typically support federalism principles, they had no choice but to become reluctant mandators, endorsing mandates when party goals or principles were at stake, but also working behind the scenes to reduce the stringency of the mandates. All right, so here's a question for the group, and I would appreciate if you could participate via the chat. Which of the following describes the punctuated equilibrium model? A, public policies tend to be characterized by short periods of stability, punctuated by long periods of radical change. B, public policies tend to be characterized by long periods of stability, punctuated by short periods of radical change. C, public policies remain linear over time. Or D, none of the above. All right, so the answer is B. State and local governments were expected to be the most significant restraint on the passage of mandates. Prior to the 1960s, federalism was considered to be one of the rules of the game, requiring major mobilization on interests and ideas when new federal powers were proposed. However, due to the decline of the endemic political ties between federal, state, and local officials and the erosion of federalism, state and local governments were now required to use interest group organizations to protect their interests in Washington. This was done through orchestrated lobbying campaigns. However, as the author states, mandates have disarmed state and local government interest groups and prevented the mobilization that was necessary to protect federalism interests. Politically compelling mandate goals made it difficult for state and local government interest groups to generate enough consensus to undertake grassroots campaigns. State and local government groups concentrated their lobbying efforts on winning concessions or securing funding to ease implementation of the mandates, with the federal carrot serving as a nationalizing influence on state and local priorities. Similar to Congress, state and local leaders did not want to oppose certain mandates in fear of negative repercussions. Instead, they focused on funding and flexibility of mandate implementation. Since mandate benefits were more apparent than costs and implementation challenges, there was a delayed reaction from state and local governments, especially for mandates with broad symbolic appeal. State and local governments would instead attack existing mandates for which fiscal impacts have become apparent. The author indicates that mandates were also used by state and local governments to gain leverage or to regulate competition with other governments, such as competing with other jurisdictions for economic development opportunities. The author discusses the irony that state policy activism can prompt federal mandates just the same as state policy inaction. As shown by recent trends, states have become policy activists and innovators in many areas, and have also replaced federal funding with state funding in certain areas. However, this same political activism has helped lay the foundation for federal mandates, with several significant mandates being preceded by similar state programs. Furthermore, state innovations and ideas have inspired policy advocates to extend the policies of some states to all states. State legislatures have become more congressionalized, with political leaders relying less on parties and becoming policy entrepreneurs. Interest groups have also increased their presence in state capitals to convey national ideas to the states. State and local leaders are becoming vulnerable to compelling causes, just the same as national leaders, with programmatic values taking precedence over federalism concerns. State and local governments have been successful in getting certain mandates modified to be more flexible and to provide funding, and Congress has been willing to appease state and local governments' concerns. This has allowed Congress to claim credit for the mandate benefits and also for saving states and localities from the mandate's worst impacts. This has helped to legitimize mandates and leads to the impression of cooperative federalism. The cooperative approach to mandates helped promote federalism values in choosing how to mandate, but it did not inform the decision on whether to mandate, which the author states is a decision that may be best explained by the coercive model of federalism. Although not included in the article, I went ahead and added this slide on the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act of 1995, which was enacted to minimize the imposition of unfunded mandates on state, local, and tribal governments, as well as the private sector. The act requires federal agencies to prepare reports for rules costing over $100 million. That includes the legal authority for the proposed rule, a cost-benefit assessment, a description of macroeconomic effects, and a summary of concerns from state, local, and tribal governments, including the agency's response to those concerns. So for the next question for the group, again, if you could participate via chat, which of the following is considered an unfunded federal mandate? A, any federal requirement that compels state or local activities resulting in additional state or local expenditures. B, any federal requirement that imposes additional conditions or increases the level of state and local expenditures needed to maintain eligibility for existing federal grants. C, any reduction in the rate of federal matching for existing grants. D, any federal requirement that reduces the productivity of existing state or local taxes and fees and/or that increases the cost of raising state and local revenue, including the cost of borrowing, or E, all of the above. All right, so the correct answer was E, all of the above. Now, I would like to open up the floor to anyone. Is there anybody in the cohort that would like to discuss any experiences in dealing with unfunded mandates, whether state or federal?
Well, we with the city of Arcadia, we have several issues such as water quality. One is the PFOS issue, and the other problem we have is with severe nitrate issues that we are dealing with. So we have to maintain a particular water quality per the state and federal mandate, but then we don't get the funding for that kind of work. So that's kind of like a little tight for us on a budget.
Thank you. That's an excellent example. Now, I'll go ahead and provide an example as well. So similar to your example, also related to water quality. So in 2001, the LA Regional Water Quality Control Board, which is a state agency, issued the city of Bellflower and all the cities in LA County a stormwater permit known as the MS4 NPDES permit. This was issued under the premise of Federal Clean Water Act guidance as a basis. However, the state went ahead and imposed requirements that were above and beyond the Federal Clean Water Act. It's what's known as the Porter-Cologne Act of the state of California. So the state of California has their own Clean Water Act. So in essence, this moved the requirements, the federal requirements, from a maximum extent practicable basis, which is do your best good faith effort, into definitive requirements. And just to give an example, one of those requirements in the permit was to install trash cans at every bus stop without any funding provided to the cities. So the city of Bellflower, I went ahead and filed a test claim in 2003 with the Commission on State Mandates regarding this unfunded mandate. It took quite a bit of years, but in 2011, the Commission on State Mandates ruled in the city's favor and required the state to reimburse the city of Bellflower a total of $534,000. Well, the state controller's office to the state finance department interjected and in 2016 challenged the decision of the Commission on State Mandates and deemed that only $3,000 was reimbursable to the city. In 2021, the Commission on State Mandates ruled in the state controller's favor. So although the city of Bellflower did not recover the $530,000 in cost, this 18-year battle, this 18-year effort led to more funding being available for stormwater programs and projects, including those of Prop 1, the LA County Measure W, which is the Safe Clean Water ballot measure. So since 2018, the city of Bellflower has now secured over $32 million in grant funding for stormwater programs and projects. But this also reinforces Posner in the city of Bellflower seeking this additional funding. We have in effect legitimized these now state mandates that are being imposed on the city of Bellflower. So this is just a snapshot of the decision on state mandates. And I'll go ahead and post a link on the chat where you can actually access all of the documentation from the Commission on State Mandates. So if you have time, go ahead and check it out. Again, an 18-year process in the making, but it just illustrates the up and downs of dealing with unfunded mandates. So with that, that concludes my presentation, and I appreciate everybody's time and participation.
Great. Thank you very much, Bernie. Well done. Yeah, the Posner article is, and you've covered all the major points of the Posner article. But you know, one thing that really strikes me in the Posner article is kind of the catch-22 that state governments are in that, as we had mentioned this briefly last week, that state governments have had some success at negotiating the implementation of mandates. And that's appealing to state governments because, again, it gives them more flexibility if they're able to negotiate implementation specifics. But the problem is once you start negotiating the specifics of the implementation of a policy or a mandate, it really adds legitimacy to that mandate. And so that's kind of that catch-22 that state governments certainly have to deal with. Just really briefly, the other thing that really struck me with Paul's article is this idea about the congressionalization, if you will, of state governments and how state and local officials are starting to look and act a little bit more like members of Congress as these elected officials, again, start to break away from their political party moorings. They start acting more like free agents, and then they go off there and start doing what David Mayhew says about claiming credit in order to get reelected. And so you kind of have motivations of state and local officials looking very similar to the motivations of their congressional counterparts. And so that's what kind of leads. Another thing that leads to this cooperative mandating that Paul talks about in the article. So, okay, very good. Thank you, Bernie. Important article, and again, some important conclusions for us, and really does a nice job of kind of tying together the political element, the fiscal element, as well as the administrative element, and putting all three of those together into one article. Okay, very good. We'll move on to our next article, and that's the American Public Administration, the International Governance article, and that is Jacqueline. So Jacqueline, turn it over to you.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
We cannot, no.
No, okay, let me see. Can you see it now?
Yes, now we can.
Perfect, okay. Okay, so good evening, everyone. My name is Jackie, and I'll be presenting chapter 24 of our textbook, American Public Administration and Impacts of International Governance. And so a quick, a quick overview of what I'll be covering tonight is we'll go through some background information first, and then we'll go through the main arguments that the authors make. Also, we'll talk about globalizing governance the American variant and environmental issues, also international governance, and the frameworks and implications for American public administration. And before we begin, I want to ask a quick question. It's just a yes or no answering, and if you guys can use the chat, please. So the first question for tonight will be, do you remember where you were on 9/11? Okay, so I wanted to ask you all this just to refresh your memory a bit, but also because O'Toole wrote this in 2002, 1 year after the terrorist attacks. And it's important to note that he references 9/11 very often throughout the article. And I think that the 9/11 attacks were a basis and foundation for this article, and it influenced the arguments of both authors significantly. Okay, so next. So the authors begin the article by explaining that the multiple forms of transnational cooperations that have emerged today have both limited national autonomy and have also facilitated effective national action. So the authors begin explaining that that by managing threats from terrorism is an example of how the efforts of the US and other US agencies, both at the national and subnational level, work together. The authors use the attacks as an example of how problems were negotiated and handled at home and abroad. So first we had first responders, firefighters, and police officers all working on the ground, trying to locate any survivors, while we had the North Atlantic Treaty Organization convened in an emergency session. So the authors do state that over 60 countries worldwide worked closely with the United States to pursue counterterrorism efforts. So while diplomats in the State Department tried to build anti-terror efforts worldwide, the FBI had agents working closely with police and investigative units in several countries. Also, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention coordinated their bioterrorism efforts. With public health authorities, the banks also played a role. Banks regulators cooperated with colleagues abroad to tighten international financial system. So in all, events such as 9/11 highlight the correlation of the globalized system, and it emphasizes the need for international cooperation. And lastly, the authors mentioned that US officials carry out their responsibilities in today's administrative world. And international organizations have been recognized for decades as essential parts of governance. And this development of transnational networks has a crucial impact. Okay, so on the next slide, we have, okay, so the authors state that a government's success in pursuing defined national objectives depends heavily on how effectively it can act within changing institutional contexts, including new transnational institutions. And the both authors argue that public administration is critically important in this dynamic globalized environment. The authors describe the changing context of public administration in the US as a part of a shifting landscaping. Also, a recurring theme throughout the article and also in this course is the importance of the interconnectedness of public administration at all levels of government. So public administrators participate, as mentioned by the authors, in the ever-shifting landscape of international governance. And that leads to my second question, which is, do you think the US intergovernmental system is becoming A, stronger and more effective, B, weaker and more dependent, C, both A, B, and C? And there's no wrong answer. This is your opinion, whether it's A, B, or C. Okay, I can't see the answer. I can't see the chat, so I'm hoping you guys are answering, but I'll share my opinion. I was going with C, and I feel like it's C, both because some of the international ties seem to make it more difficult, but nationally we're able to facilitate some of these changes. So it feels like it can become stronger in one aspect, but then also, weaker because of it. So there's no right answers, just your opinion. So I'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so in order to meet global climate goals, the federal government has implemented a variety of environmental and building code regulations. These public policies affect how state and local governments can use land. And so dealing with environmental challenges requires finding ways to gain the cooperation of governments of other countries. And the authors state that for environmental policy and management, there's been more than 170 multilateral agreements that have been adopted. And so the federal government created the Clean Air Act. And under the Clean Air Act, the EPA sets limits on air pollutants, including on setting limits on how much can be in the air anywhere within the United States. So these forms of multilateral decision-making prove the patterns involving governments and non-governmental agencies, including multinational corporations, pressure groups, and professional associations that all participate actively. So the stance that many nations take together to combat these environmental challenges reminded me of the previous and still current challenge countries are facing with the COVID-19 pandemic. So ever since the coronavirus outbreak for the past few years, intergovernmental developments and implications for regulation have taken place. So the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention created recommendations and precautions that people could adhere to prevent the spread, such as isolation, masking, avoiding contact, vaccinations, boosters, getting tested, and other factors. So this leads to our third question of the night, which is, okay, so before I ask the question, I do want to say that national and international government regulations were shaped due to the pandemic. So we had local city ordinances regarding masks. There was also flying restrictions at airports and limited number of seats sold to prevent the spread of the virus. We also had vaccine mandates for some employees. And this was just not here nationally, but also globally. So with that said, I'll ask the question, and if anybody wants to share, how did COVID-19 shape or transform your job duties, and were any of these changes permanent?
Well, I think the biggest take home of the vaccine that came out of the COVID was government employees getting to work from home, which has never been an option.
Mhm.
It was something I think most people have adapted to be a semi-permanent role working from home.
And I agree, Faisal, I'm one of those. So I started working with the courts in March of 2020, and within a week and a half of being a new employee, I got sent home, and it didn't change. I got promoted, and I'm 100% remote. So I also do think that the pandemic transformed and shaped my position specifically, because now I'm never going back to downtown. I'm always going to be here for now. So I do see your point. I'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so in the next section, we'll talk about international commitments. So there's been an array of US international commitments that demonstrate the depth and breadth of its current involvement. Recent developments regarding terrorism and international efforts to address these challenges clearly fit this developing system. However, this theme goes beyond just security, and it includes nearly every policy field. So just to reinstate, it is important to note that formal international commitments consist of both treaties and executive agreements. Executive agreements are far more numerous and are typically less noticeable. And so the next question, true or false? Formal international commitments consist of both treaties and executive agreements. A is true, B is false. Okay. Okay, so on page 291 of the textbook, we would find that this statement is A, true. International commitments consist of both treaties and executive agreements, and both categories carry the force of the law. Next slide. Okay, so moving on to the emerging governance framework. So we're looking at the establishment of multilateral regimes, often with some kind of small administration at the multinational level, but with the major portion of involved institutions and human talent retained in and by the states. So the US is part of many international agreements. These interdependent nations may find cooperative approaches that help each and all achieve objectives despite differing interests. So most nations do share interests such as suppressing terrorism, monitoring diseases, and monitoring emissions. Okay. Okay, so the next slide, implications for American public administration. As public administrators, it's important to understand the impacts of international, national, and subnational governmental relations. Regardless of the level of government, public administrators affect and are intergovernmental relations. So local policy changes can be adopted and shared by other international entities. The authors in this article contain a great deal of lessons and important implications for public administrators, regardless of the level of government. So as public administrators, it's important to understand these impacts because public policy and administration decisions made in other branches of government commonly trickle down, or they cross over into other areas of government, specifically like we've discussed before, fiscal decisions made at the federal level frequently have implications for the state government, which in turn filter down to local government entities. Also, the impacts of globalization and the advancements that have enabled the dynamic and international environment are valuable lessons for public administrators. And intergovernmental relations are becoming more and more complex. So with that said, this leads to our fifth and final question, which is, okay, so in global governance, who, if anyone, is in charge? The banks, big corporations, Musk, pharmaceutical companies, the United Nations, no one, everyone? What do you guys think?
I'll go real quick if nobody else wants to. I would say that I think the US takes kind of a soft leadership role in most of global governments, and by extension that applies to, you know, EU countries and significant EU member states like France and Germany and that kind of thing. But general like economic interdependence and all the multinational corporations that do business in all these different nations are all somewhat dependent upon the economic system remaining in place, and then the US is kind of at the helm of that. So they're kind of at liberty to create the terms of global governance as it develops further. So it's not like they have their hands in everything, but going forward, I think our role in global governance will just continue to grow, whether that's intentional or not, you know, just filling the vacuum of global leadership in the creation of all these different structures and substructures and stuff. So I would say probably the US, but I understand different arguments for like multinational corporations or, you know, the big tech companies like Faisal said, Google. That's another interesting answer, but I would probably say US.
Thank you. And I agree. I do think the US, and I also thought of big corporations as well. And then I started thinking of just everyone, everybody just pitching in and everybody just coming together. But I don't think there's like just a specific entity or person in charge. So I just think it's everybody. Anybody else?
Yeah, I'll chime in. I think I agree with you, Jacqueline. I don't think we have like no one's in charge. It's like our system of federalism. I think it becomes its own thing, and I think it just keeps going, and no one's in charge of it. No one can control it, and I think we just wait and see what's going to happen next and evolve with it as it goes.
I agree. Okay, so in conclusion, sorry, Faisal.
Sorry. I'm sorry. I think the US leadership in global governance is gradually diminishing.
Mhm.
And it is a block of countries that's emerging that I would say like India, China, and some other countries put together. I think they are emerging as a block, if any, in terms of global governance, because they have a growing young population, which can be the next big move can come through that. So it's, I mean, as much as we like to say we are in charge, but we are gradually losing our position in the world stage.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. And so before I finish with my conclusion, I did do my article critique on this article. I just didn't include it in my presentation, but I do want to just state one thing that I feel that the authors did omit and could have been implemented in the reading, and it's technology. I think that technology and the world have changed since the 9/11 attacks, especially in the policy issue of cybersecurity. So I think technology involves stronger systems that protect, the critical infrastructure of financial networks and all citizens. And so I just felt like they could have added that into the reading. And I also did further research, and I found out about the USA Patriot Act. And I wasn't aware of it, and it was passed 1 month after the 9/11 attacks on October. So Congress enacted the Patriot Act, and it gave government officials authority to surveil possible threats. And so many of the tools the act provides law enforcement to fight terrorism, and to fight terrorism that has been used for decades to fight organized crime, drug dealers, and it's been approved by the courts. So even though this article was written 20 years ago, I do believe the implementation of technology during that time would have strengthened their arguments a little more. I do agree with what they were stating, but I feel like they did omit that topic of technology in it. Okay, so now for my conclusion. So, let's see. So local public administrators' decision makings can have consequences, and this is at the state and national and international levels. And the interconnectedness of existing in international system, decisions made by local public administrators can have consequences. And so it's important to note that intergovernmental relations are becoming more and more complex, as the authors state. Therefore, as public administrators, it is vital to utilize a global perspective when navigating intergovernmental relations. And so that concludes my presentation. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for participating as well.
Great. Thank you, Jackie. Well done. Yeah, I like your slides. Slides are excellent. And this is an additional component to our discussion we've had up to this point in time. We've been talking about federal, state, and local governments and intergovernmental relations. And we have to recognize the influence of the international component. And so while local governments are looking up at state and federal government, now they also have this next level above federal government, which is the international agreements. And international agreements can have a limiting impact upon local governments, obviously, by holding them accountable for certain types of standards and rules and regulations that perhaps they didn't have any role in crafting themselves. But it could also provide some opportunities and some avenues for local governments in terms of having these discussions of trade and things such as that with foreign nations. And we've seen the increase in the trend of local mayors meeting with officials from other nations. You talk about trade agreements. And even though local governments and state governments are precluded in the Constitution from entering into treaties with foreign governments, we've still seen mayors go out there and enter into informal agreements with foreign nations. And so maybe the internationalization, if you will, is not only a limitation on local governments, but it could also be an opportunity for local governments as well. And I think I made a great point, Jackie, in terms of technology. And I do think that's a part that could be added to the article. And, whenever you're talking about an article that's 20 years old, obviously it can't capture all of that. But I agree with you. I think that in terms of technology has really changed this international component. And you have much more mobile capital now than we've ever had in the past. You have a much easier time, local governments contacting and working with officials from foreign nations than you ever had in the past. Inventories are not as physical and on hand as they used to be in the past. And so I think that technical component is a really important part of the internationalization, if you will, of federalism. And like Faisal says in the text chat, the sister city concept, and a lot of cities, if not most cities in America, have those sister cities. So, okay, very good. Well done. Thank you very much, Jackie. We'll move on to our third article and turn our attention to Homeland Security. So that's Chelos.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, let me share my screen really quick. Can you see my PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So good evening, everyone. My name is Chelo Jovellanos, and I will discuss with you tonight the reading or Article 25 in O'Toole's book on American Intergovernmental Relations. The title of the article is Homeland Security, the Federalism Challenge by Donald F. Kettle. So this is the author. He was actually one of the speakers of the series of symposia called the Federalism Challenge, held at the Rockefeller Institute of Government on March 24, 2003. And this article was his speech during this symposium. So Mr. Kettle, he's very well known in public administration field. He's a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration. And he writes a monthly column for Governing. He has his degree in political science, a PhD undergraduate degree being from Yale University. So thank you, Jackie, for precluding about the 9/11, because we'll also discuss this event tonight. Okay, so we know that the United States Department of Homeland Security is the US federal executive department responsible for public security. Its stated missions involve anti-terrorism, border security, immigration and customs, cybersecurity, and disaster prevention and management. The department was created in response to the September 11 attacks. President George W. Bush announced its establishment to coordinate the Homeland Security efforts. So the events of 9/11 dramatically raised the stakes for American government's ability to address the problems of Homeland Security. Confronted for the first time with an adversary with the ability to plan and carry out attacks which inflict massive casualties, American governments find themselves required to take large-scale actions on a variety of fronts to identify and apprehend would-be terrorists, protect critical infrastructure, and prepare to respond to future attacks. While much attention has been focused on the national government's efforts to address these problems, there has been less consideration of the role of state and local governments, which play a critical role in preventing and responding to terrorist attacks. The symposium in 2003 was held 2 years after the attack. They focused the attention on the role of state and local governments in homeland security. The symposia featured nationally recognized experts who convened to contemplate the most important challenges for state and local governments in homeland security and identify what government must do to keep our nation secure. That symposia focused on the following 4 topics: public health, federalism challenge, the detection and prevention of terrorism, and first responders. So we have our first question here. Did the Homeland Security Services improve after 9/11? Yes, definitely. So it's obvious, right? Like when we go to the airports, we have this really tight screening and things like that. Following 9/11, the federal government moved quickly to develop a security framework to protect our country from large-scale attacks directed from abroad, while enhancing federal, state, and local capabilities to prepare for, respond to, and recover from threats and disasters at home. I'll give you 2 examples. The first one was the security flight. Fulfilling a key 9/11 Commission recommendation, DHS, or the Department of Homeland Security, fully implemented a secure flight in 2010, in which the TSA prescreens 100%, no exceptions, of passengers on flights flying to, from, or within the United States against government watch lists before travelers receive their boarding passes. Prior to secure flight, airlines were responsible for checking passengers against watch lists. Through secure flight, TSA now vets over 14 million passengers weekly. Also, they've included advanced passenger information and passenger name record data. To identify high-risk travelers and facilitate legitimate travel, DHS requires airlines flying to the United States to provide advanced passenger information and passenger name record data prior to departure. During 2008 and 2009, the PNRs, or the passenger name record, helped the United States identify individuals with potential ties to terrorism in more than 3,000 cases. And in fiscal year 2010, approximately 1/4 of those individuals denied entry to the United States for having ties to terrorism were initially identified through the analysis of PNR. Okay. So Donald Kettle discussed in his speech the critical issues to be addressed for Homeland Security to be more effective. The first one is effective and strong public health system. Public health has not been carefully integrated into an effective first response system. So public health infrastructure provides communities, states, and the nation with the capacity to prevent disease, promote health, and prepare for and respond to both ongoing challenges and emerging threats to health. A rapid multi-sectoral public health response at the county level, together with technical support from state and federal, is required to save lives and minimize public health, social, political, and economic consequences. And this is the reason why we need an effective and strong public health system. The second one, local schools should act as first responders. Schools should have a plan to put in place in case of threats or danger. I mean, right now, what are the things that are happening at our schools? We have active shooting, overdose at middle schools. You know, there's just a lot of really, really bad things that, you know, making our kids vulnerable to this set of crimes. Kettle said that we do need a plan. And I think the first thing we need to do is partner with first responders and law enforcers. There's a suggestion about giving them some type of mapping data for critical incidents. We can give them the aerial images of schools, floor plans, including room and suite numbers, building access points so that, you know, if something happens, let's say another active shooter comes into the school, then they will be able to, our first responders and our law enforcers will be able to access and have a plan to go into the school and take that active shooter down. So I have a question about that. Do you have any other suggestions on how local schools can respond to cases of threats or danger? Anyone?
I think better parenting can help.
Yes, I agree about that, Faisal. Oh, what happened to my, okay. Better parenting, in the sense of what? Can you elaborate further?
Well, there's a significant amount of dysfunctional families right now. So, you know, most of the time, when you look at some of the people that have committed, I'm talking about children that are in the age groups that committed, they had shown some kind of tendency. Sometimes it could be a mental health issue, or sometimes it's a situation in their home that has made them bitter about the world.
Yeah.
And so they carried out, you know, like, and it can't, it can be from any age group, but even college level, but it's a possibility.
Yeah, I agree with you. Can you give me one moment really quick? So sorry about that. Let me just check on my door. I apologize. Give me one moment. Thank you. I apologize for that. Okay, so the third critical issue is the variations in preparedness at the local level. Significant regional variations in communities. So let me give you an example. New York City, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, California. These states are likely targets of terrorism. Therefore, they have the most preparation in place, right? But in many smaller communities, the level of preparedness is much lower, which raises an important question. I mean, what if terrorism attack happened in these communities? Let's say, for example, in schools, right? In Uvalde or maybe in Sandy Hook. So we don't know when and where will this happen. Those communities most likely to be at risk, you know, are the ones, this is our mentality, are the ones that often tend to be best prepared. And the places that are least likely to be affected are the ones that have tended to pay less attention to security. So there is a widespread variation around in the country, and many state and local governments have simply not taken this issue seriously. The fourth one is coordination. Of course, this is the administrative strategy of Homeland Security. For Homeland Security to work effectively, coordination with other levels of government is crucial. With a wide variation in local preparedness, coordination is going to work effectively as long as communities will work closely with each other. The next one is communication systems. So we need effective communication. It is crucial for Homeland Security to work. So in his speech or in his article, Kettle described how communication system can be and how important they are. He gave the example about what happened at 9/11, wherein the police department had better information about the condition of the World Trade Center towers than did the firefighters who are at the inside of the tower. But because the police, because the police department had a helicopter circling overhead, right? They radioed the information to the police commanders. However, those police commanders were not in touch with the fire commanders who are in the lobbies of World Trade Center. They did not have access to anything, not even the TV pictures that all of us were watching at the time. So aside from this, it was also known that there were so many local communities around the country where radio systems were not interoperable. And really the status overall, we do have significant problems of communication that frustrate and complicate the problems of coordination. And the last critical issue is funding or money. There is no question that local governments, they really need funding like urgent, right? They want greater funding to help with the purchase of, some communication equipment, first responder suits that they are equipped to handle emergencies in times of disaster or if they're being attacked by terrorists. Kettle suggests to use funds as incentives to get local communities to encourage them to engage in the kind of coordination that's required by Homeland Security. So 4 years after 9/11, DHS encountered another issue on handling a disaster. Let's hear from Dr. Ryan Streeter, former policy advisor to President Bush at the time of Hurricane Katrina. So at that time, around 1,800 people were killed when a hurricane caused storm overwhelming riverbanks around the city. Dr. Streeter called the response to the disaster a failure of government at every level. So let's watch this. Let me see, I think I need to exit and go to the YouTube.
There was certainly a lot to criticize. It was a failure of government at every level. The scale of Hurricane Katrina overwhelmed the federal emergency management agency, FEMA. They were not prepared for a crisis of that size and a dislocation of that many people. Emergency response in the United States is typically driven by states and localities first, with federal assistance coming in behind that. And you also had multiple levels of breakdown in the city of New Orleans and the state of Louisiana as well. And so the agencies were uncoordinated. FEMA had recently become part of the newly created Department of Homeland Security. And so the chain of command issues also came into play there as well. And so instructions would be given from Washington that would change on the ground, and then coordinating with local and state officials became almost impossible because of the corruption and troubles that they had within their own governments. And pardon the expression, but it was a perfect storm of government failure at all levels.
Yeah, I mean, as you make clear, there problems in terms of where the orders are coming from, who's taking the orders, the logistics, the processes. But it also, seen in our correspondence, referred to as President George W. Bush flying over in Air Force One, not landing. And it was peculiar, wasn't it? Because we thought back to 9/11, we see George W. Bush with the bullhorn addressing the firefighters. This was a man who got the crises when it comes to public relations, and he lost the touch when it came to Katrina. What happened?
But I think it was again a breakdown at all levels, and in that particular case, the pilots were instructed not to come in. It would have been more of a complication to bring the airplane in than to land. I think in retrospect, it would have been better just to figure out how to get that plane on the ground there, so he could have been the commander in chief, the trusted face of the government on the ground. So I think everyone regrets not having done that. Whether or not it would have helped is another matter. I think like I said earlier, the scale of the devastation was so strong that every pre-planned intervention and response was inadequate to the scale of the storm. Over the years, about $71 billion have flown in to New Orleans from the federal government. And even though, as your correspondent reported, the recovery has been uneven, there is something of a miraculous rebirth that's happened in New Orleans.
We'll get to that, but I just want to finish
Okay, let's go back. Okay, so now let's have some discussion. Any thoughts about the video?
Yeah, Cello, this is Steve. I can speak to that.
Go ahead, Steve.
Well, many thoughts. I'll keep it brief though. What a lot of people don't know is FEMA has been around for a long time. They've been around since like the 70s, and they've responded to hurricanes and disasters for years. But after DHS was created in 2001, they absorbed FEMA underneath them. And so the two got integrated. And then when Katrina happened in 2005, they just didn't have the integration, just wasn't done. It wasn't really complete yet. So there was like this shifting of priorities from DHS of like, hey, we're not so much worried about hurricanes anymore. We're more worried about Homeland Security and terrorism now. And then Katrina happened, and there's a bunch of stuff that happened with that. The interoperability problems they're talking about with like communications, that was because the disaster was so severe, they had resources responding from out of state and all over the place.
Yeah.
And when they got there, they didn't have the right radio channels programmed into their radios, so they couldn't talk to each other. And you compare that to what happens in California literally every year, is that we're so good. We do this every year. We do mutual aid incidents. We respond to each other's emergencies all the time, that it's like a night and day thing. So what he was talking about in the article about the variations in standards of coverage between like rural areas in America stood out to me as being the most severe, because things that emergencies that happen in like urban areas in California are pretty dialed, and none of those flaws would happen. But if it happens in like a real rural area out of state with not a lot of resources, that's where the problems happen.
Thank you so much, Steve. Crystal, would you like to say something?
Yeah. So a couple of things just to kind of continue on Steve's topic. So I'm actually involved with the interoperability network of the South Bay, which is the seven South Bay cities that coordinate their emergency response with police chiefs, fire chiefs, and then other county fire organizations. So we actually put together a joint powers authority to be able to have that interoperability in the event of an emergency in the South Bay area. So that's definitely a real thing, even down at the local municipal level. And then the other thing I wanted to bring up was the interview that you played for us really reminded me of an interview that I had seen. I don't remember, I think it was like an NPR thing where they were discussing how the way FEMA kind of dropped the ball on Hurricane Katrina, the CDC did the same thing with COVID-19. So it was interesting to hear almost, exactly the same conversations that unfolded when COVID-19 and the CDC hit the fan, or dropped the ball, I should say, because they weren't prepared for what they were set up to do. So I think it's definitely, like, at the federal level, there is a major disconnect that we keep seeing these recurring themes come up.
Yeah, Crystal, I actually do agree with you. And I was kind of like reflecting how this disaster happened 20 years ago. It happened again during COVID-19. Like, just in our city where I live, people did not believe our local public health. And there was just so many misinformation that's been going on that, I think majority of our constituents did not believe our government, what they had to say, like some type of mandates and all that. So yeah, we still lack, this type of system response in terms of coordination and communication. So thank you so much for sharing. Okay, yeah, so that's actually another example of intergovernmental failure on emergency response after Katrina. Can anyone just give just one more example for number 2? Or share? Thank you. All right, no one wants to share. Okay, that's fine. Let's go ahead and continue. Going back to the article, Kettle outlined some of the steps that he believed were necessary to build an effective intergovernmental approach. The first one is to create minimum level of protection. So Kettle said our country needed to establish some type of minimum levels for local protection so that there's at least a floor for the level of homeland security around the country. He also mentioned about setting standards for risky events and for preparedness and response to levels of risk. The second one is to strengthen local coordination. So according to Kettle, there has to be coordination for homeland security to work. There has to be a set of financial incentives associated with it. It is important that to strengthen the local coordination, states must act as coordinating vehicles, since the nature of the problems and responses vary substantially from state to state. It is also true that many local governments have an intergovernmental relations office. However, their functions are usually focused on the individual benefits of the government itself, as opposed to more general federalism questions. The third one, modify systems for funding. Kettle suggested an effective intergovernmental response is essential, and that the government needs to create a different system of intergovernmental aid to make sure that homeland security problems will be solved. The federal government needs to set minimum national standards. The states could receive block grants with considerable discretion, and local governments would have primary responsibility for carrying the funds. And finally, testing systems. To build an effective intergovernmental approach, we need to test the new systems that were planned to make sure that the odds these plans will work under pressure will be improved. So that's actually the end of my discussion. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, the floor is open right now. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Joe. Very well done. And yeah, there are a lot of important elements in this article. I think you covered the vast majority of them. One of the issues that we see is with homeland security, issues of homeland security or natural disasters, we've always had communication issues in federalism. Right? Anytime you have federal policy, but then you have the implementation of policy at state and local levels, you're going to have those types of communication issues. The problem, though, is in event a natural disaster or an event that threatens homeland security, it really just magnifies these communication issues that are always there. If you don't have these major issues that magnify them, you're not really going to see the communication issues as readily. And one example, a microcosm of some of these problems with communication, the Real ID Act is a great example. We've been waiting now for all states to come into compliance with the Real ID Act. The Real ID Act that came about in the Bush administration after 9/11. And we just continue to give states more and more time because it's been very difficult for states to get a critical mass of their citizens to come into alignment with these Real ID requirements. And again, the Real ID Act requires that state issued identification cards or driver's licenses contain certain required elements in order to be able to be used for the purposes of federal transportation. So if you want to use that as your ID in order to get on a plane at an airport, it has to be in compliance with the Real ID Act. But again, since states are having so much trouble implementing it, we've continued to give states more and more time and push that deadline back. And then along came COVID, and the deadline was pushed back to October of 2023. And now the deadline has been pushed back again to 2025. So you'll be looking over about 2 decades since the law was passed and still has not been fully implemented. And again, that's just a good microcosm of a federal objective trying to be implemented by state governments. And so whenever you have that type of disconnect, it's going to be difficult to get these policies implemented. And whenever it's a high valence type of issue like homeland security or natural disaster, these issues of coordination really do end up becoming magnified. So very good. Thank you, Jello. Appreciate that. We're halfway through our article, so let's go ahead and take a break. Let's take about a 10-minute break, come back at 7:25, and we come back at 7:25. We'll have Jelani and then Steve and then Perla. We'll finish up those last three articles when we come back. So take a 10-minute break, come back at 7:25, and then we'll have Jelani on deck for the intergovernmental relations article. Okay, welcome back. Hope you had a good break. I see Jelani's already got the slides up, so I'll go ahead and turn the floor over to you.
Okay. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to be presenting the article Intergovernmental Relations and Federalism as Past, Present, and Future, and Does Anyone Care by Jonathan Walters. Quick summary of the article. This article is an excerpt from a paper written for the MacArthur Foundation in 2005. It calls for the support to expand the study of intergovernmental relations in the United States. Walter's focus is concerned with the fact that there's no central organization to organize research into intergovernmental relations, and we'll go ahead and discuss the article. The article is structured into 4 subheadings. The first subheading is intergovernmental relations, a study in long-standing neglect, the heyday of intergovernmentalism, the current state of intergovernmental studies, and the prospect for a new ACR. So the first part is the intergovernmental relations, a study in long-standing neglect, and Walter begins the article by proclaiming that the study of intergovernmental relations historically has been a disorganized enterprise, and it continues to be so today, except for 40 years of our history. The 40 years in which Walters is referring to is the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations, which was established in 1959 and defunded in 1996. I believe Kamara last week mentioned this commission. Unfortunately, it got defunded in 1996. Ever since then, there's no single entity or commission to study intergovernmental relations. There's no entity convening people, collecting and analyzing data, or doing policy work related to intergovernmental affairs, relationships, and cooperation. And basically, just studying how all 3 levels of government interact with each other on an ongoing basis. Walters sees this as surprising. According to Walters, all policy area that the United States deals with has some intergovernmental consequence. Some of these major policy areas include environmental protection, education, health, social services, tax administration, immigration, energy, election reform, transportation, and business regulation. Those are some of the major policies which affect all levels of government. In these areas, the federal government sets policies, and the state and local governments are usually responsible for delivering the results. Walter sees this as counterintuitive not to have any entity investigating the effects and consequences that these policies produce on the other 2 levels of government. So my first question of the day, my first question would be of the day. I hope people participate. Can anybody else provide other examples of national policy affecting state and local governments? It can be anything simple. This can be from an experience, or maybe it's a policy issue that you are interested in, and briefly talk about the effects it has on your agency or organization.
I think in recent times, there is a lot of sharing of resources in solving the unhoused problem. And today, the new mayor was sworn in, and it is going to be a priority. And I think right now they are looking for national strategies to deal with the unhoused. That would
Yeah,
be policy.
yeah, Faisal, that's a great example. Obviously, these issues are contemporary issues that we're facing at a national level, but at a local level too, because we're the ones that witness the homelessness in our cities. The national government just implements policies or provides fundings or programs to combat the issue, but in reality, it's the local governments who are doing the work. I do want to provide an example that Walters provides in his paper during the Iraq War. Even so, Walters claims that even foreign affairs is related to it has an effect on local government and state government. For example, in Vermont, criminal trials were being put on hold because of call-ups of state and local law enforcement officers who belong to the National Guard during the Iraq War. So that's an extreme example how foreign policy even affects state and local level. So if national policy is so impactful on the other levels of government, how come there's no interest in studying its effect? I think that's what Walters is trying to answer in his paper. Walters sums it up in one quote. He says the cause of intergovernmental relations and relationship is so deeply ingrained in the American way of government. Indeed, it's a foundation of our system of governance that rising above the fray to analyze intergovernmental affairs as a specific area of study just doesn't seem to come very naturally. Furthermore, he states that the major policy is debated on its merits, and with the Washington spin, state and local impacts of major policy areas are ignored. This can also be said about state policy. One example is state legislators debating policy and not even ignoring local government and their effects that state policy might have on these local governments. Furthermore, how such action will impact states or localities is frequently an afterthought. Everything is focused on the view of the federal government. Even if the effects of these major policies are studied, they usually are done by a small number of scholars and journalists, and is usually done after the policy has been implemented and not while it's being discussed. So I think I kind of want to connect this to what Jacqueline was saying earlier about how the system of federalism and intergovernmental relations is so complex that there's usually no one in charge of it, and there's no single entity responsible for overseeing the complex of the system. So I feel like it becomes problematic in which people don't want to tackle the issue just because it's too complex to dissect and analyze. But why does it matter? Why should we be studying? Why should we be studying intergovernmental relations? Does someone want to chime in? Maybe no right or wrong answer. Just your opinion. Why do you think it's important that we're even in this class studying intergovernmental relations? Anyone wants to share?
Yeah, I think at this point in our, I guess in our nation's history, it's really too late to unwind all of these intergovernmental relationships that have been established over time, and we're like almost in too deep to not have these intergovernmental relationships.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, Crystal. Like I said before, I feel like the system's too complex already. I don't think we have a hold on it in a way where we can dissect it or analyze it. Anyone else has an opinion on this matter? Why do you think it's important to? Why does this matter? Why are we in this class? Why are we learning about this? Like I said, no right or wrong answer.
Jelani, can you restate your question, please?
So why does it matter that we're studying intergovernmental relations? Why should we study intergovernmental relations? What's the benefit of doing so?
I think it's basically we have unlimited needs to fulfill, and we have so much limited resources to provide them. So intergovernment resource allocation can be a great help, as well as there is the benefit of economies of scale that can come with sharing agreements. Right. Recently, we have been using cooperative agreements to even bid projects, because instead of going through the whole entire bidding process, we go through a process that is by using the already bid documents from other agencies, and then we piggyback on that. So it's like we don't have the capabilities in all organizations to do all the work. So having these relationships help in bringing better coordination, and also to serve the people better.
I definitely agree with you, Faisal. I think that's I definitely agree. Like in my opinion, I would say it's to effectively tackle the issues that we face today. If it's administrative challenges that we face in intergovernmental, like you stated, Faisal, or fiscal challenges, I feel like local governments are on the front lines. For example, the pandemic, climate change, trade, and migration. And I believe it's important to study the cooperation between all three levels of government to better understand how to tackle these issues, right?
Yeah, also, like, for example, the city of Arcadia, where we have like the 911 call center, we handle not only our local calls, we also handle nearby city calls, because some of the nearby cities won't be able to handle hundreds of call volumes at the same time. And similarly, when we have an emergency situation, our calls get routed to nearby agencies like police departments, where then they put it into the system. So it's kind of like we need that help. Otherwise, we cannot have like a huge 911 center that can, we cannot pay for that. We don't have the resources. So we have to share those capabilities. And I think that's where the cooperation among agencies make a big role.
Right. Again, like you said, Faisal, yeah, I believe we're tackling an issue and we should be cooperating to tackle these issues. So we have three levels of government that we can utilize. And we should be able to see what works best, right? To see what supplies us with the products of our system, and what keeps our country going. So going back to the article, so one of the most pressing issues on why we should be studying the effects of national policy, again, as it relates to intergovernmental relations, it's federal revenues versus spending. Current revenues do not cover federal expenditures according to the Government Accountability Office. If federal revenue and spending trends remain unchanged, the federal government would only be able to cover half of their commitments by 2050. Remember, this was written back in 2005. I haven't looked at a recent report if that's still the case. But it comes down to the fiscal challenges that governments face, that being the federal government, and what federal policy costs us on these local governments and state governments. So what does this unsustainability mean for other levels of government, basically? Walter states that unsustainable spending has a trickle-down effect on other levels of government. Like I said, remember this article was written in 2005 when the Bush administration promised to cut the budget. Medicare and Medicaid were the targets of these cuts. These cuts had the potential to shift spending from the federal government to other levels of government, state and local. Furthermore, consequences should be studied because of reduced cooperation between the three levels of government, and unsustainable spending by the federal government can cause great harm. Walters provides two examples on how to reduce intergovernmental cooperation and action have led to environmental and public health problems. For example, Walters describes how high rates of cancer in areas of poor air quality and the contamination of the water supply in Midwestern states are due to a boom of factory farms. These have had negative effects on the environment and people. Moreover, the idea to cut spending on Medicaid can lead to this trickle-down effect that affects people having access to mental health resources. So it is necessary to study the impacts that federal policy has on areas on the environment and mental health at the state and local level, because people's lives are at stake. Basically what it is, I think Walter sums it up pretty good. It's people's mental health that we need to worry about, the environment, people's health. Finally, Walter believes that we should also be studying the legal battles around which level of government ought to exert the most influence in what areas. In other words, we should be analyzing the roles of the different levels of government when implementing policy and trying to determine the area and roles where each level of government is most effective. Obviously, we have a constitution. There's stated powers for the federal and for the state. Federalism has evolved throughout the years, that it has become so complex that we don't know what level of government should be doing what. And I think those are questions that must be answered. And I feel like that's why Walters is advocating for information, for analysis on these issues. But overall, Walter believes that the fiscal relationship between all levels of government is the most important reason why we should be studying intergovernmental relations. So again, it comes back to that fiscal challenges that federal government faces, and these fiscal challenges that the federal government passes on to the state and local levels, which affect people in the end. The next section is the heyday of intergovernmentalism. Walter calls the heyday of intergovernmentalism is the reign of the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. It was active from 1959 to 1996. It was responsible for looking at policy and programs from the standpoint of fundamental interplay of local and state federal governments, their programs, policies, personnel, revenue raising systems, and capacity and budgets. Consisted of members of Congress, 4 state governors, 3 members of state legislatures, 4 mayors, 3 county officials, 3 private citizens, and 3 representatives of the executive branch. Scholars, let's see. The ACR was defunded in 1996 by a Republican Congress and support by President Clinton due to the commission's view of unfunded mandates. Also, Walters in his paper describes that most scholars believe that ACIR was created because of 2 intertwined forces: the increase in federal transfers to state and local governments. Again, this shift that happened in intergovernmental relations, in which federal started providing more money to state and local governments, and also the migration of groups representing state and local governments to Washington. So groups of lobbyists moving to Washington and lobbying for these state and local governments. It's what led, according to Walters, to the ACIR. So the question is then, is it possible to have a commission like that of the ACR? Walters, for his paper, interviewed many experts in the study of intergovernmental affairs. One of the experts, obviously Larry O'Toole, the editor of our textbook, claimed that it may be difficult due to the complexities of federalism. Here again, we see how complex federalism has evolved, and just it's not manageable to control and to study. There are tens and thousands of governments in the United States that it might be difficult to discern and collect data on them. It would require a dedicated group to conduct all this work. Furthermore, O'Toole states that another challenge is to focus interest on a system that nobody in particular is responsible for. It's extremely difficult. Then going back to Jacqueline's article about who owns international governance. Same thing with federalism. No one owns it. It's a system that evolved by itself, and like Crystal stated, it just keeps evolving, and no one's responsible for it. I believe Atul means with this quote that federalism is always changing and evolving and has taken its own course and has become too complicated for people to want to pay attention to it. People rather let the system be and let it function on its own than try to analyze it. And moving on to the next section, the current state of intergovernmental studies. So Walter describes the current state of intergovernmental relations with the quote from an analyst. Remember, this was written in 2005, and this is what this analyst said. We are now living in an era when the federal government has stopped sending you money and instead is sending you problems. The quote, according to Walters, reflects three important things: that there has been a profound shift in the relationship of federal, state, and local governments in the past quarter century, which we have discussed in this class. There are a lot of scholars and analysts studying this shift, and it also reflects how far the country has drifted from the days when all three levels of government actually and would sit down to hash out policy and budget. But what is the current state of intergovernmental studies, and who is doing the work to tackle the issue? So the current state of intergovernmental studies, it's a set of individuals and institutions that have continued to analyze local, state, and national issues from an intergovernmental view. Organizations such as the National Academy of Public Administration have advocated for the creation of a forum of intergovernmental cooperation, which would convene interested individuals from all levels of government to discuss and debate intergovernmental cooperation. Universities, schools of public policy and administration, just like this one, they continue to talk about intergovernmental relations and the significance to our system of administration. Think tanks and nonprofit research organizations that have led the effort into the study of intergovernmental relations. But still, there's no central organization such as the ACIR to look at the issues and the data consistently and systematically. There has been no organization to replace the ACR since it was defunded. The fact that there hasn't been an organization, according to Walter, begs three questions. What effect does that have on governance in America? Does anybody really care? And who might pick up the standard? So the last part of the article is the prospects for a new ACR. The last part of the article, Walter tries to answer these questions with the help of experts in intergovernmental relations that he interviewed for this paper. So what do the experts think? Most people interviewed for Walter's paper believe that the current state of intergovernmental awareness and cooperation is in critical condition. Most believe there's a lack of understanding of implications that occur at the state and local level due to the action of the federal government. Remember, again, this paper was written in 2005, and experts were discussing the consequences of legislation such as the Child Left Behind Act, consequences such as the costs incurred by the lower levels of government, revenue implications of the moratorium on internet taxes, and the trickle-down cost of federal tax cuts. Most experts also interviewed for the paper agree that the ACR has left a hole in encouraging and advocating for better intergovernmental relations, that there's no organization tracking trends in federalism, convening policy makers and analysts to discuss the challenges that a complex federalism brings about. In terms of answering the question posed by Walters of what effect does that have on governance in America, there are four issues that analysts agreed that required studying. Again, this was in 2005, and these are the four issues that analysts agreed on: the out of balance revenues and spending demand across governments, healthcare finance, current tax structures at all levels of government and relationships between them, and the need to consider reassigning responsibilities among governments. Furthermore, most experts interviewed believe that there's value in reinventing an organization like the ACR. But the question is it feasible? Some expert Walter interviews believe it would be difficult to do, since some view that Congress has no interest in the area of intergovernmental affairs. Others argue that there's a sign of revival in the interest of studying intergovernmental relations. Some examples include the resurrection of the Administrative Conference of the United States, or ACUS. The organization is a body set up to consider and help hash out intergovernmental issues associated with Administrative Law and Procedures. It should be noted that this Administrative Conference of the United States was defunded along with the ACR, but they were able to. There was signs of revival and interest in bringing this conference back up. Moreover, other experts see that agencies have placed some interest in studying intergovernmental relations. Agencies such as Department of Health and Human Services and U.S. Environmental Protection Agency are aware and the need to further study the impact of policies on the other levels of government, since most of the policies that they are involved with require state and local cooperation. A report by the U.S. Government Accountability Office conducted in 2020 reviewed 24 federal agencies, and out of the 24, 14 had an official agency-wide intergovernmental affairs office studying intergovernmental affairs within the agencies. Others believe that there's a craving for information from the state officials for good information on finance and economic policy. And finally, experts believe that the longer Washington goes without a commission like the ACR, the less likely one will be established, as policymakers and analysts will lose interest in the study of intergovernmental relations. The paper ends with Walters advocating for the creation of intergovernmental forum organized by Washington the National Academy of Public Administration. He believes this is the best option of pursuing the study of intergovernmental relations and facing the challenges that we face today. So establishing a forum with the National Academy of Public Administration at the helm. So what do you think? Is this the best option? Is it feasible to create such an organization today? Is it possible to do it today's environment that we live in, to resurrect something similar to the ACIR? Anyone want to chime in? No wrong or right answer again, just your opinion.
Hey, it's Janine here. I think it would be possible, but I think because of the highly polarized situation that we're in, I don't think that they would be in agreement, but I think it would be most for governmental relations and for the country to move in a better way of managing money and managing grants to have a type of commission like this.
I totally agree with you, Janine. That's actually my closing argument. That yeah, we're too polarized to establish something similar to what we had back in the 90s, the 80s. Anyone else? Any other thoughts? Okay, perfect. Then I'll go ahead and do my closing argument. So like you said, Janine, in today's environment, one can argue that as federalism becomes more complex, the interest in studying it diminishes. I believe that due to today's political environment, reintroducing a commission such as the ACIR would be difficult. Scholars such as John Kincaid argue that the creation of the ACIR today is impossible because of the growth of federal power, the rise of party polarization, and the decline of bipartisanship. Kincaid argues that achieving a consensus on today's issues is difficult. Thus, it would be challenging to gain bipartisan support to revive an organization similar to the ACIR. But Walter's paper is important because it highlights the challenges that have risen due to the complexity of federalism. The article exemplifies the need to understand how national policy and the administration of the policies affect the other levels of government. Furthermore, the article represents a calling to stray away from the federal-centric view when analyzing policy, but instead focus on how policy impacts all levels of government. Finally, the article touches on the challenges our system faces in the future and implores solutions to better the relationship of our constituted system. What this means for public administration is that administrators should have an interest in studying intergovernmental relations. The ongoing complexity of the system requires administrators to convene and gather data to be effective when the federal government implements policy. However, if a forum is unavailable to collect this data, public administrators should advocate for this study within their programs, agencies, and government. I believe that the future for the study of intergovernmental relations will be conducted within the agencies that we work for. And that is my presentation.
Excellent. Thank you, Jelani. And this is one of my favorite articles because, as you know, you've had me in class several times. You know, I have a favorite answer and a favorite question. Favorite answer is it depends. Favorite question is so what? And I like to call the Walters article the "so what" type of article. So, there is no longer an ACIR. We've gone, what, 26, 27 years without an ACIR. So what? What difference has it made? And it has made a difference in that we don't have that overarching organization to organize research into federalism. And so it's what what Walters refers to as, now, since we don't have an ACIR, we have to do what he calls watering the thousand flowers, meaning that there are people doing work on federalism and intergovernmental relations all over the entire country. And we need to support all those individual projects because we no longer have that overarching organization that will be able to coordinate all this type of research. And so really, essentially, and I think Johnny picks up on this very well in his closing, is that what it means is that we all have to keep federalism at the forefront of our thoughts and our research, and that we in our individual organizations and agencies must consider federalism issues along with the policy issues as well. Why do people not look at these federalism questions? Well, primarily they don't look at these federalism questions because, as Spraja told us in her article, it's because it's the bloodless politics. And so it's not the exciting type of politics to argue about like we have with policy types of issues. The really concerning part of the article for me is the question of, since we've gone so long without an ACIR, does that then hurt the prospects of a new ACIR? And I think obviously Walters is kind of asking a question that he's already answered. And the answer is yes, that the longer we go without it, the less people think it is necessary and the less interested people may become in questions of federalism. And the less interested people become in questions of federalism, then the less likely we are to have a new ACIR. It's kind of one of those tautological chicken and the egg types of arguments. And so the prospects, I agree with Walters, are not very good for us having a new ACIR because it's difficult for us to get bipartisan agreement on anything in Congress, especially putting precious resources behind funding an organization that oftentimes challenge the actions of Congress itself. And so I think it's very little chance that we'll end up with another organization such as the ACIR. So again, it becomes incumbent upon us to do the research ourselves and to put the effort into not only asking the policy questions, but also asking the federalism related questions. And again, Jelani, I agree with you. I think it's going to be individual organizations, universities, think tanks, and agencies that are going to continue doing this federalism type of research. Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. We'll move on to our next article, and that is Steve's article, Fiscal Federalism and Economic Crises.
Yeah, hi, everybody. Steve here, me again. I went ahead and dropped the article in the chat in case anybody would like to follow along. It is titled Fiscal Federalism and Economic Crisis in the United States, Lessons from the COVID-19 Pandemic and Great Recession. Let me share my screen here. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So in this article, the authors state that during the 2008 Great Recession, fiscal federalism took a more gradual approach before lending aid to the country. But during the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a more immediate shock to the markets and required the government to act more abruptly. The authors give a few examples of how the three layers of government must work together during the financial turmoil in the United States. Essentially, when the local governments, like cities, get overwhelmed, the counties and states must step in. When the states are no longer sufficient, the federal government must intervene. The biggest differences between the two recessions is that COVID-19 required a lot more aid and it was needed a lot more quickly. The Great Recession did not have as much aid rendered and it was required over a longer period of time. The authors make an argument that the current architecture of fiscal federalism is actually an obstacle for the federal government to render aid promptly enough to make a difference. So to put the COVID-19 crisis in context, the architecture of fiscal federalism has not really changed over the years, but the COVID-19 pandemic did bring to light some flaws. Federal governments have more actions at their disposal than local and state governments do not. For example, the Federal Reserve can print money and Congress has no hard rule on deficit spending, but local and state governments have little action outside of emergency reserve funds. Local governments may file for bankruptcy, but states cannot. When compared to the Great Recession, the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic were more immediate and dependent on public policy changes and intergovernmental aid. By July of 2020, the recession reduced economic activity by 11%, nearly 3 times the decline seen in the Great Recession in 1/3 of the time. This is largely due to travel restrictions and shelter-in-place orders. Communities heavily dependent on tourism felt this the most, such as Santa Monica. State and local governments were so quickly overwhelmed during COVID-19 that the federal government had to take action immediately. In March of 2022, the federal government passed 2 bills, the Families First Act for $166 billion and the CARES Act for $299 billion. The CARES Act is the larger of the two and comprised the majority of state and local aid during 2020. Compare this to the Great Recession, where no intergovernmental aid was given until 2009, despite technically starting in 2007. The article does not cover the $350 billion ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act, that passed in 2021. However, this is a very significant part of the intergovernmental relief that was given. And I'm going to get into ARPA a little bit towards the end during some of my closing thoughts. States have control over spending adjustments, revenue increases, accessing reserves, and relaxing public health regulations. The vast majority of states saw a significant decline in revenue collection during 2020. States had to adjust by cutting or freezing spending over other strategies, including raising revenues or accessing emergency reserves. The negative effect of the pandemic on states financially was not as severe only because of federal aid. States can also raise revenue by increasing existing tax rates or adopting new taxes on a permanent or temporary basis. Raising taxes was not really done during the pandemic because it would have been too difficult and taken too much time. However, some states did do this, such as Arizona and New Jersey, who raised taxes only on high income earners. Raising taxes in the future will most likely be inevitable, though, because of inflation, which we're all currently seeing. Policymakers are generally conservative when accessing emergency reserve funds and instead try to adjust spending and revenue levels first. In 2020, only 15 states needed to access their emergency reserve funds. Because of federal aid, only half of the states did not have to cut spending in fiscal year 2020. A survey of 900 cities conducted by the National League of Cities reported that about 70% of cities had a negative economic effect from COVID-19 during fiscal year 2020. Local governments each responded to the pandemic a little differently, and we still do not have a complete picture of what long-term effects will be. However, common examples in 2020 were workforce reduction, hiring freezes, and incentivization of early retirement. I saw this in the city of Visalia, who reduced workforce in 2020. And one of the first things I noticed was more overgrown trees that we could not drive fire engines under. So my interpretation of this article, it's a long article. but it gives an interesting perspective on the differences between an acute onset pandemic emergency, which is really more of a disaster type situation, public health crisis, and a lesser acute economic recession. I felt like there really was no fair comparison between the two, and the article really should have been titled Economic Recessions versus Disasters. The COVID-19 pandemic really was a health emergency first and has more similarities to a natural disaster. The economic impacts were only secondary to the actual emergency. There was much this article leaves out in the overall picture from COVID-19. Some examples include social distancing, shelter-in-place orders, and 14-day quarantines for anyone with potential symptoms. There's still, even today, so much that we don't know about the COVID-19 pandemic. There were a lot of important events that happened to manage the COVID-19 pandemic that the article didn't touch on, such as a blanket federal disaster declaration for all 50 states, FEMA's supply chain stabilization effort and Project Airbridge, as well as suspending rent and insurance payments and planning for hospital surge. On March 13th, 2020, President Trump declared a nationwide emergency consistent with the Stafford Act, so that governors of individual states would not have to request their own individual emergency disaster declarations. All 50 states were approved for disaster declaration to assist with additional needs. One of the earliest sources of disaster relief was the deployment of the National Guard. By March 22nd, FEMA permitted full reimbursement for the National Guard forces, which were deployed to establish field hospitals and medical care units. Another one of the federal government's roles in the coronavirus response was to serve as a central data hub for emergency management community and to share data, maps, and information for all agencies responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. FEMA also had to work with Health and Human Services to ensure limited supplies of critical PPE, or personal protective equipment, and supplies such as ventilators that are in the right place at the right time and in the right quantity. FEMA led a supply chain stabilization effort, which involves preserving the most critical medical supplies at hand, as well as identifying suppliers and purchasing additional supplies and expanding current and new manufacturing capabilities. For example, FEMA has been leading the project of getting alternative production companies like General Motors to start manufacturing ventilators instead of automobiles early on in the crisis. Another key role for the federal government and Federal Emergency Management Agency was Project Airbridge. The Airbridge was created to reduce the time it takes for the U.S. medical supply companies to ship critical PPE and medical supplies to the United States for supply chain distribution. As part of the economic relief effort, FEMA extended the grace period to renew flood insurance policies from 30 to 120 days. FEMA suspended rent payments through July 15th, 2020 for disaster survivors living in temporary housing units in California, Florida, North Carolina, and Texas. Another big thing that happened during this pandemic that wasn't a factor during the Great Recession was the nation's healthcare system had to operate at surge capacity. And when this happens, there's four key components: increasing hospital capacity, identifying alternative care sites, registering medical volunteers, and also altering established standards of care. In closing, the COVID-19 elicited a far more expansive federal response than the Great Recession because it was really a different emergency entirely. I would have liked to see the article have given a better representation of all the many different things that had to happen for the COVID-19 response to be successful, rather than just giving a glimpse of relief that was provided in only fiscal year 2020. This was a pretty small window of what happened. And to be fair, we're still dealing with economic impacts of COVID-19 even today as I give this presentation. So I had the privilege of working through both recessions, actually. So I was a new firefighter during 2008, and there was a lot of things that we saw then that I feel like we're really not seeing now. Primarily, the environment was completely different. So like we had to take pay cuts and furloughs, and it was just a really doom and gloom feeling compared to today. With what we're dealing with now after COVID-19, it's actually, from what I see, is the opposite. We've got all of these relief bills like ARPA, which my city was given like $35 million of ARPA funds last year that they was kind of excessive, and they still don't know how to spend all of it. So we're still dealing with that. We haven't taken any pay cuts. We're actually still getting pay raises. And so that and many other examples, I just feel like they're two completely different situations. Probably a better comparison would have been like COVID-19 versus the Spanish flu, or the Great Recession of 2008 versus the stock market crash of the 1920s. So I would love to hear some other opinions from classmates. Were you like me? Did you work through both recessions? Do you agree with me that they are very different, or do you disagree with me, and why? So I will open it up to the class.
Hey, Steve, this is Crystal. Interestingly enough, where you ask, excuse me, if we agree with you that they are different. Excuse me, geez. Speaking to the city that I work for, just recently presented the first quarter results of the city budget, and one of the comments that was made by our finance director is that there's no question that a new recession is coming. The real question lies in what type of recession. So to answer your question, I did work through both recessions. I would say the biggest difference from 2008 versus 2013, was it? Is that the 2008 recession, I think, was fueled by mismanagement at a lot of different levels. And that mismanagement allowed me to afford my first house at 22. Whereas the 2013 recession was a little bit different in terms of the financial impact, where I don't think I would have, I mean, I was not trying to, but I don't think 22-year-olds would have been able to buy a home the way I was able to in 2009 compared to the recession that came around in 2013.
Yeah, thank you, Crystal. I actually had a pretty similar experience too. I bought my first home during that time as well, which compared to, I actually feel really sorry for people that are trying to do that right now, because it's a completely different environment.
I think, can I share?
Yes, go ahead, Faisal.
So, well, during the first recession, I mean, during the 2010, I was furloughed. I was working for the city of Long Beach at that time. And I was furloughed, and also that was the reason that I really lost my job and I had to move to the city where I am currently. In terms of the biggest difference I see is during the recession in 2010, banks got rich. The recession in 2021, it's the pharmaceutical companies got rich. So it's just like, who is going to make the big amount of money? That's just the biggest losers, and the biggest gainers I see are the banks and the pharmaceutical companies here.
Yeah, that's a good point, Faisal. Thank you for that. Would anybody else like to comment?
This is Bernie. I was also on board with both recessions. So yeah, in 2008, we did the furloughs, took pay cuts, lost a lot of staff, cut back on maintenance cycles. You mentioned tree trimming, for example. You know, we went from a 2-year cycle to a 3-year cycle. But in this current one, the COVID-19 recession, we were kind of gearing up for the same thing. I actually cut about almost $1 million from my capital improvement program. And then all of a sudden, you know, like you mentioned, ARPA, So we started seeing the bailouts that we were seeing in 2008, but this time they were coming towards us, right? Instead of the auto industry or the financial industry. So yeah, took a pay cut in 08. Luckily have not taken any pay cuts during the COVID-19 recession. And then to answer your last question here, what are we doing with our ARPA money? So I'm in the design phase right now for a $10 million teen and senior center at one of our parks. So that's one of the uses that we found for that money. And then our city council actually paid employees hero pay out of ARPA funds, because like most of the cities, we never went remote. We didn't telework. For us, it was open and business as usual. So those are two things that we ended up using the ARPA money for.
Yeah, thank you, Bernie. And I included that question specifically about the CARES or ARPA money, because that is, to me, that's the most obvious way we're seeing fiscal federalism from this COVID-19 pandemic. So, you know, the ARPA Act gave federal money directly to cities.
I have a question for Bernie. How much was the bonus to city employees at your city?
It was across the board, $3,000 for all staff, irrespective of classifications or bargaining units or non-represented employees as well.
Oh, thank you, Bernie. We are just in a similar process. It's going to be a similar amount for people that were there pre-COVID, and like halfway, like a 50% for those who came in between COVID.
Hey, Steve. This is Crystal again. It's really interesting to hear how is it Visalia that the city that you work for?
Yes.
Between yours and Bernie's comments of like all the extra things that, you know, they're able to do with the ARPA funding. My city got 24 million in 2 tranches of 12 million. And the only thing that did was allow us to balance our budget and keep just under $600,000 in reserves. So it's interesting to hear you guys still kind of like figuring out what you want to do with it, when ours was pretty much spent before we even got it.
Oh, wow. Is that Torrance?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm currently managing a project spending like $1.2 million to get new radio communications equipment for all my fire engines that we probably could have waited on, and that's all going to be ARPA money. So sounds like some differences there.
Yeah, feel free to send the city some of your extra money that you're swimming in over there, Central Cali.
Crystal, I'm not sure whether the numbers you're quoting is correct, because Torrance has a lot of money and it's a lot of development happening. I'm not sure where the money is going.
Faisal, are you accusing us of cooking our books? No, I'm just kidding. No, so this was last fiscal year. We ended with 600,000. This year we're up to, I think, 44 million in reserves. But after the ARPA money, we only had 600,000 last year compared to where we are this time, and a lot of it is just extra revenue that we're bringing in other areas.
Maybe you are headed for a recession then. Maybe I'm wrong. That's all I have, unless anybody else would like to comment. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Well done, and a good discussion. I agree with you in terms of your analysis of the article. I do think that the economic crisis part of it was ancillary to the public health crisis. And I agree with you 100% on that. I think that, what we saw, I also agree with you in terms of what we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic, is we saw a disaster that was rolling out kind of in slow motion. And so it is a much different type of disaster than we normally think about when you think about natural disasters or, threats to homeland security. And that those tend, you have a hurricane and it's a rather immediate type of event, and then it's over with, and then it's about how you do the cleanup and how you get people rehoused and then preparing for the next one. But this has been a slow motion over a couple of years and counting now, public health crisis and disaster. And so I do agree with you that it's kind of a different type of beast altogether as compared to what you normally think about with an economic crisis or a recession. I also think we had kind of a masking of some of the economic impacts through these federal grants. And we sometimes see that happen where, from a research perspective, it's difficult for us to actually quantify the impact of something because we've had all this federal money rolling in. And I think we saw that at a state level in terms of, I did a lot of work years ago on tax limits. And, in fact, my dissertation was on the impact of property tax limits on local school district finance. And we couldn't really see much of an impact of Proposition 13 immediately because the state was backfilling a lot of this lost property tax revenue and had backfilled that lost property tax revenue for 3 years. So from 1978 to 1981, there really wasn't a negative impact on local property tax revenue until that state backfill money started to go away. I think we're going to see a similar thing here. We're starting to see a similar thing here with COVID-19 in that as the federal grants do start to go away, that's when we're really going to rip the Band-Aid off and we're really going to see the true fiscal impact of a public health crisis like this. And I think there's a very famous theory in public budgeting called the flypaper effect. And it's from an author by the name of James Fawcett. And Fawcett argues in the flypaper effect that money tends to stick where it hits, meaning that when a state government receives federal money or a local government receives state money, they're going to look at that kind of as free money, and they're not going to use it to replace some of their local source revenue. And so they're not going to make fundamental changes to their revenue portfolio diversity because of this presence of intergovernmental money. This money is going to kind of stick where it hits because there's a concern that once that money is gone, then it's not going to be there anymore. And you don't want to make these promises to your citizens, and then once that federal money is gone, not be able to deliver on those promises or need to raise a lot of local source revenue in order to keep delivering on the promises. So I think one of the interesting things we're going to see happen is that as this federal money has come in, some of this money has been very targeted, some of it has not been quite as targeted, and some folks have shared how their cities have used that money. I know in my school district, we were looking for how to use the money because we had a limited number of things we could spend that federal money on, and the money really exceeded the need. And so we did have millions of dollars that was left over, but we couldn't spend it on other things that we needed. It had to be directly linked to learning loss that came from the COVID-19 pandemic, that came from remote learning. And so the problem that we ended up with is that a lot of money, but you can't use it for the things you really need to use it for. But some of the things that the money was being used for, now while that money is starting to go away, you kind of raise expectations on the part of parents that these things are going to be paid for. But then once that federal money goes away, those expectations don't go away. Parents still expect that those programs will still be delivered to their children. But now you got to find a way to pay for those programs because you no longer have the federal money coming in. And so it kind of shifts the priorities of that local education agency to try and meet these higher expectations that they have from their parents. And, so I think it really does lead a little bit to some distortion in terms of those priorities for those local education agencies. But again, I really do think that, this federal money, this the magnitude. I know that during previous recessions, there has been some money that has flowed in from federal government and from state government. But I think the magnitude and the speed at which we receive this federal money has been different for COVID-19. And again, I think it was different because it was such a public health emergency. So it kind of, we get that money, it kind of masks the true impact. The state of California was doing really well financially until now. And now, instead of seeing these large budget surpluses, we're now looking at a budget deficit. And I think that's what's happening. We're starting to really see the true impact a year or two later of that public health emergency. And so whereas California is feeling really good the last year, this year they're not feeling so good because they're really starting to see that impact. But thank you very much, Eva. Again, I agree with your analysis. I think that's a great interpretation. I do think we really need to look at the economic crisis as kind of being ancillary to the public health crisis, because the public health crisis is really what was first and foremost. I heard from Perla. Let me double check. I got an email from Perla, and I believe that because of a work obligation, she thought she would be able to be here by 8 o'clock. Not going to be able to make it here tonight because of work. So we will need to push Perla's article, the Federalism by Waiver article. That one will need to push to Saturday. So what we are looking at for Saturday is we have 7 articles on the agenda for Saturday. So we do have a very full session on Saturday. I do think we'll have a good chance to get through it all in our allotted 3 hours. We have the 2 State of American Federalism articles, Owen and Jackie. We have the tax cuts article for Roberto. We have the voting reform article by Leanne. We have the governors in control article by Lizette. We have the Federalism by Waiver article that Pearl will do for us. And then that additional article that we added on to the beach board site, the Federalism and the ACA article that Oyuki has located and Oyuki will then do for us. So those are our 7 articles. I think on Saturday, we will start with Perla's article, Federalism by Waiver. Then we'll move into the State of American Federalism articles and proceed from there. Do you remember you have your final discussion board post on Homeland Security that is due on Saturday? And any of these remaining article critiques, the ones that we're going to be doing on Saturday, those need to be turned in by Saturday. So make sure to get those turned into the Dropbox. Then after we're done with class on Saturday, we'll have everything wrapped up. I'll spend the weekend going through your article critiques and assigning all the final remaining points, and then have your final grades ready to go then by the beginning of next week. Then you get your winter break. So you can enjoy your winter break until I believe it's January 7th is when your final class begins with Dr. Matthews Grant Administration. That will then run through into February. And then it'll just be a matter of finishing up any remaining case studies you still have left to do, then pulling your portfolio together and getting your portfolio submitted no later than May 1st, which will then allow you to graduate in May. So that's where we are currently standing in preparation for our Saturday session. Any questions or anything at all about Saturday or where we're going in the class? Everyone good? Okay. Well, thank you for being here tonight. Again, we'll do our 7 articles we have remaining on Saturday, finish up the course, and then we will move onward and upward. We'll start on Saturday bright and early at 9 a.m. and hopefully be done by noon. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week, and I will talk to you on Saturday morning.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Yeah.
Thanks. Good night.